As I've stated in a previous lesson, the first 15 years after the end of World War II was an era of conformity. There was a picture of what an American family should look like. A husband who went to work every morning, a wife who stayed home, cleaned the house, and took care of the children. They usually owned their own house, their own car, maybe two cars. And from the end of World War II in 1945 through the end of the 1950s, this is what most Americans strived to become. Starting in the 1960s, this started to change. You started to see certain groups within the United States striving to not help the country as a whole, but to help the particular group that they belong to. And in the 1960s, probably the best example of this would be the Civil Rights Movement. When Martin Luther King led the March on Washington, or when he led the march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. He was not fighting to help the United States as a nation or as a whole. He was fighting to improve the lives of the African American community. And toward the end of the 1960s, you start to see other groups do the same thing. Three noteworthy groups would be Native Americans, homosexuals, and women. So let's look very quickly at the American Indian Movement, or for short, AIM. So there's three noteworthy events that take place during the American Indian Movement, the first being the occupation of Alcatraz Island, which sits in San Francisco Bay. And for around 30 years, it had been the home of a federal prison, which had closed in 1962. So by the late 1960s, the federal government was not using Alcatraz Island anymore. So in November of 1969, a small group of Native Americans landed on Alcatraz Island and refused to leave. They set up camp there, and supporters would send them boatloads of supplies so they could stay there. And they claimed that they were occupying the island because it rightfully belonged to them, because Native Americans were the first group to ever occupy the North American continent. One of their leaders issued a proclamation which he titled "The Proclamation to the Great White Father and All His People." The Great White Father being President Nixon. And he says that we will purchase said Alcatraz Island for $24 in glass beads and red cloth, a precedent set by the white man's purchase of a similar island about 300 years ago. Now, what he's referring to is the purchase of Manhattan Island in New York by the Dutch in 1624. And according to legend, they bought this island from the Native Americans for $24 worth of glass beads and red cloth. Now, that may or may not be true, but it's definitely an expression of anger toward the American government and its treatment of Native Americans. He goes on to list 10 reasons why Alcatraz would be a good Native American reservation. And as you read through it, it becomes obvious that he's being sarcastic, but he's basically listing grievances against the American government. I'll just read a few. It is isolated from modern facilities and without adequate means of transportation. It has no fresh running water. There are no oil or mineral rights. There is no industry, and so unemployment is very great. There are no healthcare facilities, and so on and so forth. Anyway, These Native Americans actually managed to stay on the island for a full 19 months before they were finally forced to leave in um, June of 1971. A few years later, or I guess a year following the occupation in 1972, uh, a group of Native Americans marched to Washington, D.C. They called this the Trail of Broken Treaties, and they presented a list of demands to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, including improved housing, education, economic opportunities. They demanded that new treaties be drafted and that the government return Indian lands, and so on and so forth. Perhaps the most dramatic event to occur as part of the American Indian movement was the Wounded Knee occupation. So, as you may remember, in 1890 there was a massacre of Lakota Sioux Indians um, at Wounded Knee Creek in, I believe it's South Dakota. And a large group of Native Americans occupied the site as part of a protest, and they refused to leave. Eventually, law enforcement officers arrived and surrounded the area, and there was a standoff between the Native Americans and these marshals and FBI agents for a full 71 days. Both sides fired on each other, and two Native Americans were actually killed. Several of their leaders were arrested. So, Wounded Knee received a second reason to be an infamous site. As far as the gay rights movement, you have to remember that one, homosexuality was not an accepted lifestyle in any way as far as the mainstream American public went during up until this time period. It was considered by doctors to be a mental disorder. If you liked somebody of the same gender or were attracted to somebody of the same gender, they concluded that you must have some kind of mental disorder, and it was also illegal. You could be arrested for committing a homosexual act. You could be arrested for dressing in the clothes of the opposite sex. But in the 1960s, you start to see homosexuals organized for the first time. And one of the early events in the gay rights movement is known as the Stonewall Riot, which occurred in New York City. The New York police raided a gay bar known as the Stonewall Inn, and they were preparing to haul several of the people there to jail, when a crowd formed and started throwing bottles and bricks, and eventually forced the police to actually take cover inside of the bar. And the riot lasted for a few days. And this is sometimes considered to be one of the opening acts of the gay rights movement. In fact, that's why June is considered to be Gay Pride Month, or at least one of the reasons why June is considered to be Gay Pride Month, because it coincides with the anniversary of the Stonewall Riot. As far as leaders, the only person that mentioned is Harvey Milk, who was one of the first openly gay men to be elected to public office. He served on San Francisco's Board of Supervisors, and he was eventually assassinated. As far as women's rights go, remember, by this time, women had received the right to vote, but you start to see an organized women's rights movement for greater freedoms. Many women felt that it wasn't right, that many of them were expected simply to stay home, raise kids, and cook for their husbands. In 1972, Congress passed the Education Amendments Act, and the most important part of that was Title IX, which prohibited sexual discrimination in education. So schools could not turn down applicants simply because they were female. One of the women who helped draft this bill was Patsy Mink, who was the first Asian American woman elected to Congress, and she had actually gone to law school because she had been turned down from a medical school because she was female. In 1973, just a year after the Education Amendments Act, you had the Supreme Court case of Roe versus Wade, which many felt was a victory for the women's rights movement. It stated that women had the right to have an abortion up until the end of their first trimester. I believe there were 2 states at the time that still outlawed abortions, and the Supreme Court ruled that to completely outlaw abortions was unconstitutional, and they had to allow women to have them up until the end of their first trimester. Still a very controversial subject, but was considered by many to be a victory for the women's rights movement. One setback that I feel like is worth mentioning in the women's rights movement would be the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment stated that women would be entitled to all the rights listed in the Constitution. And it was passed by Congress in 1972, and as you should remember, in order for an amendment to officially become part of the Constitution, it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states, which means that at least 38 states had to approve the amendment. Well, Congress gave the amendment 7 years to receive the required 38 states, or to be ratified by the required 38 states. And by the end of that time period, it had only been ratified by 34. It was given 3 more years, but by the end of that 3-year time period, it still had not been ratified by any other states. So the amendment actually died, and in part of this, because many of the opponents to the amendment included women who felt that if the amendment passed, women would actually lose more than they would gain. For example, they felt that women would possibly not be entitled to alimony in divorce cases, or might be subject to the draft. So, to this day, this amendment has not passed. There have been some attempts to, get it passed here within the first few years, but as of now, it is still not part. It's still not officially part of the U.S. Constitution.